be changing tack slightly. My presentation is more focused on people, and these are just some of the preliminary research results from the research I've been doing in Betty's Bay. But before I just get going, I'm just going to give you an overview of the presentation. We'll just be briefly having a look at the field site and a bit of the history to the field site. From there I'll move on to the methods. Some of those results, obviously not all of them, I'll be selecting the most pertinent ones, and then some next steps and possible future options. So as I said, it's field site in Betty's Bay, which is roughly about a 1.5 hour drive from Cape Town, and it's a very beautiful place, massive Kogelberg Biosphere Reserve, which is under the UNESCO banner, and just below the Kogelberg, but quite separate from it, is Stony Point, which is just that green little bit here, which has been housing an incredibly fast-growing penguin colony. And as you can see from the blue area here, that's a residential area. So similar to Boulders Beach in Simonstown, for those of you that are familiar with that. And this setup, this spatial setup, obviously presents a really interesting and challenging management conundrum, especially because penguins arrive roughly 150 years after people in this area. So the residential area is one that's relatively well established. People have been there for a long time. And then sometime in the 80s, the first penguins appeared. And the reason why there's a lot of interest, and one of the reasons why I'm specifically in Betty's Bay, is because it's, I think, the only colony at the moment that is growing. So the African penguin is listed as an IUCN endangered species, and it's not doing too well. But thankfully at Stony Point it is doing very well, and the question is why. And specifically my role is to look at how to improve some of the management around the reserve, because it has over a number of years, or well over a decade, had quite some big challenges in terms of managing residents in the area, and pre-existing, or the past management structures haven't really been able to have the ability or the capacity to really engage with residents in a constructive way, and it's kind of presented a situation that's not been very good for the penguins, and concerning because it just adds another level of pressure to a population that really doesn't need it. So I'm trying to figure out ways to improve this, and just to give the management of the reserve a bit of a more robust capacity for all the challenges that it faces. The main problem that I'll be focusing on is the one of fencing. So there is currently a fence that runs between the blue and the green line that I've indicated there, and it's been an issue of contention because it essentially blocks residents from accessing the ocean, which is something they had been able to do since ever before the penguins actually arrived. But I'll get into that in a bit more detail in a bit. The other issue is also that the penguins, up until very recently, haven't really been monitored or managed at all. So there was very little knowledge around what state they were in and how fast the colony actually was growing. This is just to give a bit more context to Stony Point. Ironically, it used to be a whaling station. So it has some interesting structures to it, and that also kind of sets the scene, I think, for some of the challenges that are currently being faced by the reserve. And it's something that I think really important to keep in mind, is that historical context that every reserve has by definition. Now I'd just like to have a quick look at the methodological approach I've been using. And there are two main approaches that I've used, and I began with the ethnographic approach, and then towards the middle of this year I've wrapped up a questionnaire methodology. The ethnographic approach has been one that I started out with, And it's really central to the fieldwork that I've done, because the intention with the ethnographic fieldwork is to get a very, very good handle on people's perceptions around the reserve and what possible avenues there are for collaboration between everybody that's involved in the reserve. So not only residents, but also tourists, neighbouring areas. So Betty's Bay is just around the corner from Kleinmond and Hermanus in the one direction, and Royals and a number of other places, and they all see visitors from different areas. So the ethnography is really there to get a good handle on this, and ethnography involves long-term and repeat engagement with people, so it's not quick and dirty. It's really about getting stuck in and actually spending time in Betty's Bay. In this case, it's been roughly 5 stints of 3 to 15 days over about 1.5 years that I've spent in Betty's Bay. And the aim is essentially to unpack the differences between what people say, what people do, and what people say they do. And that's kind of very central to ethnographic approach, because those 3 things are almost always completely different. So someone says, I swim regularly, they probably don't. And if they say, well, I mean, you get the idea. I'll leave it at that. And one of the ways I do this is through participant observation, and that's about looking at the networks of people and institutions, and as I mentioned earlier, the history of the place, Betty's Bay, but specifically Stony Point and the whaling station, but also the wider historical context of the space. Then also the institutional history. So who were the previous managing authorities? In this case, it was Overstrand Municipality, and it's just recently moved over to Cape Nature, which I'll also get back to in a bit. And then linked very closely to that is also the history and policy. Changes in institutions often bring with them changes in policy, and how do these things play out on the reserve. And then just to draw attention to or to give you an example of what it is that participant observation and ethnography helps you do, is that in the beginning when I got to Betty's Bay, I'd hear some residents say they don't want penguins in their garden. So the penguin colony has been growing, penguins have been expanding, fantastic, but they're starting to nest in people's gardens because they're running out of space in the rocky shore area, which isn't really surprising, but people like their gardens, and now you've got guano everywhere, and relationships aren't as rosy as they once were. At the same time, when the suggestion came to put up a fence, the very same people would say they don't want a fence, they want to be able to access the ocean as they always have been. Now these seem to be 2 completely contradictory statements, and seem completely irrational, and why would you say something like that? But it's exactly these kind of things that I'm trying to unpack and get a better handle on through the ethnographic approach, and it just helps me prevent asking oversimplified questions such as, do you see the fences necessary, and does the colony bother you? Because at the end of the day, if you ask those kind of questions, you aren't really going to get very helpful answers that help you understand that what actually was going on is that people didn't really have a problem with the fence, but as it turns out, the problem was actually how the fence was actually implemented. The process, and I can very much relate to that, it was very kind of brazen and didn't really do any participation. It didn't really include people in the process of deciding how to manage the penguins, which is really unfortunate because people were very fond, and actually still are. I don't want to paint this picture as worse than what it is. But you had very good support for the penguins from people, and then through this poorly coordinated management intervention with the fence, a lot of animosity was established, and people actually saw penguins as a big problem. So my point here is simply that just coming in with a question and asking people what seems like a simple question is not necessarily going to give you an answer that really gets you any further in terms of your understanding of the issues at hand. And the only way you can really get to that is through rapport, building good rapport with people, and making sure that you have a good relationship with them. So this set up the scene for me to set up a questionnaire, which was basically a flyer that I would hand out, and I kept it very brief. It was door-to-door mainly. It was most effective. So far there are 45 respondents, but it's ongoing. Data is easily entered into a spreadsheet that I have, so it kind of runs on its own. Whenever I'm there, I can hand out more questionnaires. And I've made sure that I've given it to a wide spread of residents, as well as a good geographic spread to avoid any bias that's closer to the reserve. Just briefly to look at some of the results, and I think I'm just going to skip right ahead to some of the strong responses that I had there. And it was great to see that almost all respondents wanted more visitors. Some of them had a caveat. They said yes or no. I'll get back to that just now. 3% said no, but I think they were just grumpy on the day. All want an interpretive centre, which was really great to see. So they'd like to see some infrastructure there, literally all of them, which was great. There's specific ideas around the interpretive centre as well. So people clearly are thinking about these things. It's not a strange concept to them. And the caveat that I wanted to get back to is that people were emphasizing proper management. So they don't mind having more visitors, more traffic, more litter, and those kind of things, but they want to see the place managed properly so that the effects of more visitors aren't that bad. So people are still willing to talk about the difficulty of managing the reserve, which is, I think, very encouraging to see. In terms of the questionnaire, the next steps would be focusing on more international tourists and tour operators and getting their perspectives on why they come and visit the reserve, which is actually quite far out of the way. So it's surprising to see the large number of visitors there are. It is quite a complex place, and my question is, how do you manage it? And I'd really appreciate feedback and any kind of critical thoughts that people have. And the conceptual framework that I'm working with at the moment is something that draws on both adaptive management and social ecology as an approach to talking to residents as well as the managing authority, Cape Nature, and finding a way to implement a management plan that really addresses everybody's issues. And in that way, actually, through things like citizen science, you can have residents actually helping with chicken egg counts. And in a situation that has a very constrained budget, those kind of things are incredibly helpful in actually strengthening the reserve and in turn supporting a critically endangered species. And this helps reduce negative media coverage, of which there has been. And there's less conflict, which just creates more time and effort problems for limited staff. So the focus goes away from actually conserving the penguins to dealing with problems that actually shouldn't really be there. And yeah, just to wrap up, I'd like to thank some really important people that have helped me along the way. And otherwise, I'd look forward to any comments or feedback. Thanks very much.